Hi, my name is Brooke Stanley, and I'm a senior in the McDonough School of Business studying finance and management. I'm also happy to be representing the Georgetown Scholars Program, a program built by Georgetown to support first-generation and low-income students, and I'm honored to serve as this year's student board president. I'm excited to introduce Tom Steyer. Mr. Steyer founded his own investment firm and the organization Next Gen America, a nonprofit group that combats climate change, promotes social justice, and increases participation in our democracy through voter registration and grassroots organizing. Tom grew up in New York City, the youngest of three brothers. He graduated from Yale and earned his MBA at Stanford. Please join me in welcoming Tom Steyer to the stage.
Thanks, Brooke. Thank you very much.
Hey, Chris. How are you?
Good. How
Good
you
to
doing?
see you.
Nice to see you.
All right. So let's start with you're coming at this from a somewhat different perspective than some of the other people I've talked to who are elected officials. You worked in finance, and you also have funded a bunch of organizations, including ones focused on climate. Take me through when you realized, what made you realize the urgency of this issue?
Well, Chris, probably somewhere around 12 years ago is my guess. We used to play a game at the table in our family of go forward 100 years and look back to the present time and see what we're doing that's just absolutely crazy. And we just kept coming back to climate. That in fact, everybody around the table, and my kids at that point were between 19 and 13 years old. It was like, this is going to be in 100 years, we're going to look back and say, how could those people have been so brain dead that they didn't deal with this issue when it was right in front of them? And so I became very focused on it because I felt as if that's going to be the thing that is going to determine, that is going to be a hurdle for us succeeding as a society across the board for every single person, then we should make sure that we solve it, that it's got to be job one.
What have you learned from the work that you did on climate before entering politics or running for office?
Well, it's really funny. It really has been like peeling an onion to understand how to solve this crisis. I originally felt that the way to do it was through technology, that if I invested in general research to help industry come up with new solutions, that would be the way to do it. And so I did that. I tried to fund basic research at universities so that they could come up with new solutions. I then thought the way to do this is a bipartisan effort to show that in fact, if we solve climate, we'll be better off, there'll be more jobs, the jobs will be better paid, we'll be healthier as a people, particularly people in low-income areas, and we can lead the world again commercially, financially, and morally. I thought, if we can show that it's just a pure win for America, that everybody will get behind it. And then it became clear to me, actually that's not true. There are a bunch of people who are making money off this who are going to fight to the end to keep making that money, regardless of the effect on the health and safety of every American. And I decided we're just going to have to win this fight, and that's when I started to get political.
When did you, explain to me why you think, obviously the fossil fuel interests have a monetary investment. What is your theory or understanding for the Republican opposition? Is it just that, or is it something more?
It's the money.
You think it's money?
Look, the thesis of my campaign for president is that corporations have bought the government, that the government has failed, and that it is failing because it's not of, by, and for the people, the way we're brought up to think, that in fact it's of, by, and for the corporations. And that if we're going to get the kind of policy action we need, we're going to have to break that corporate stranglehold. And you can look at this as the poster child for corporate control of our government. There is no argument about what's happening here. We have solutions at hand that will make us, as I said, better employed, create millions of jobs, make sure the jobs are better paying, improve the health of Americans, particularly black and brown communities. Let us go back to leading the world because this is a global problem. It's a absolute straight up win. It's very doable, and our government has passed nothing at the national level. Absolutely nothing. They are failing in their basic responsibility to take care of the health and safety of the American people.
What is your understanding of what is required of us to meet the IPCC's targets?
Well, let me start, before I answer your question, Chris. to explain to people what the IPCC is. You know, it's really the UN. They have been doing projections, and in Paris, 194 countries, including the United States, agreed to what we would do to reduce our carbon emissions between now and 2030. They were voluntary promises, and in fact, the US has subsequently withdrawn from that agreement, and no country is living up to its promises. So really what I would say to you is, I don't take the UN's arguments as enough, because what we can see is living up to the UN promises isn't enough, and no country is living up to it. So the real question is, how are we actually, in the real world, going to change the way we generate and use energy in a way that we're sustainable, and we have a planet that we can hand on to our children that is healthy and growing and prosperous?
Your plan largely follows the contours of attempting to get to, or targeting getting to, I think, net zero emissions by 2045, if I'm not mistaken. Walk me through how that transition happens at the scale that it needs to happen.
Right. Well, let me say this. I believe my plan is qualitatively, significantly, completely different from every other plan out there.
Why is that?
Because first of all, this is my number one priority. Putting a plan on a piece of paper doesn't get anything done in the real world. The question is, how is it going to happen in the real world, given the fact that our government is failing to do anything? I would declare a climate emergency on day one. I would call on Congress within 100 days to pass some version of a Green New Deal, but I would start to use the emergency powers of the presidency immediately.
How expansive are those? What tools do those give you?
It's basically regulations. It's things like regulating how we generate energy, electricity, what kind of car rules there are, building codes, how we use public lands, whether we allow them for oil and gas drilling.
Would you stop renewing leases on
Yes.
fossil fuel extraction?
Yes. And so there are a number of them, and it goes much more broadly than that, but that gives you a flavor for what would happen. Secondly, I would immediately initiate a process of going to the most affected communities. What I found is that in order to come up with the right policy, it is absolutely essential not just to have the counsel from the outset, but the leadership from the outset of people in the environmental justice movement, people from the communities, because America has concentrated its pollution in the low-income neighborhoods that don't have political power. So if you look, for instance, in my home state of California, in the city of Fresno, in West Fresno, people have a 22-year lower life expectancy than people who live 2 miles north of them.
Wow.
The pollution is concentrated. So to me, it's essential to go to those neighborhoods and make sure that this plan reflects the needs of those communities that have been so targeted for pollution. And third of all, I think it's absolutely incumbent on day one to make it clear to the world that yes, we're going to renew our alliances. Yes, we're going to renew our partnerships. Yes, we're going to go back to be a trustworthy, value-driven country. But this is priority one. This is a global problem, Chris. If you're not dealing with it globally as the priority, it's not going to happen. As I said, no country is living up to its UN promises.
Do you think there's any, I want to follow up on that. The Paris framework, as you noted, we're going to hear from countries next week. And the reporting indicates that everybody's missing the targets, which is...
Every single country.
Every single country. That's not good. Do you think there's a bilateral channel to be explored with China as the 1 and 2 emitters to work out an actual real binding deal?
So in answer to that question, I'd like to go back to what President Obama did in coming up with the Paris Agreement.
Yep.
He started well more than a year before the actual Paris meeting, and he started with a bilateral agreement with China.
Right.
And then he did a bilateral agreement with India and one with Mexico. So in fact, yes, there has to be leadership in the world beyond the United States. But we are, as Madeleine Albright said, the essential country. We are the country that has to lead here on a moral and visionary basis. We're the country that needs to lead technologically, financially, commercially. This, if you look, Chris, I like to use an example so people can understand how truly international this problem is. We are down to 237 coal plants in the United States of America. We've closed 290. There are approximately 1,500 coal plants in the world, and there are plans to build more than 1,000 more. If we close 237 coal plants in the United States of America, that isn't going to solve the problem of climate pollution from coal in the world. So this really has to be an example of where we make a commitment to this, we make it the first priority, we go to the rest of the world and lead them in making sure we can create energy much more cheaply with renewables than we can with fossil fuels now, and we have to make sure other people understand that and are enabled to do that.
There are several plans out there, and I was talking to Bernie Sanders yesterday, who has, I think, $200 billion in the plan to do essentially investment in clean energy around the world, global clean energy around the world, and intellectual property transfer. Is that an important part of this, do you think?
I do. I think that there's no question that investing in technology and research and innovation is something that America has. That's what we do. We lead the world, and it involves a significant commitment to research. Of course, that's true. But let me say this. I have followed this for well over a decade. I know the technologies now. We can do this right now. We have the ability to do this right now. When people wonder, is this doable? This seems like such a huge, problem. Are we up to it? We are definitely up to it.
You're saying technologically?
Yes, but we can do it and have cheaper energy. We can do it and create a more prosperous, better paid America.
So explain to me the mechanism. Let's say that you were able, we'll just focus on the policy for a moment. Let's say in a world in which you were the President of the United States and
I get everything I want.
Get everything
including from Congress.
Right. What are the mechanisms by which the transition, particularly in the energy sector and the transport sector, and then agriculture as well, what does that look like? What's the mechanism? Is there a carbon fee? Is there?
No, honestly, I am open to a carbon fee, and it's different. And I can bore you for longer than you want about the different ways to do it. But what we've found is actually that setting rules for American industry to abide by so they can do it in the best possible way is actually the most effective.
Just like emissions caps, basically.
Yes, I mean, in effect saying this is the miles per gallon rules for Detroit.
Right.
This is what you have to do by this year, you figure out how to do it. This is how many EVs you have to have by this year, you figure out how to do it. This is how much clean energy you have to have by this year, you have to do it. Look, I've been doing this for well over a decade. We've gone out and beat the oil companies, beat the monopoly utilities by saying, you will create 50% clean energy by 2030, let's put it on the ballot, let the people in the state vote, and they vote for it. We've said, let's go to what the people want. The people want this.
Right. So
it can be done, and it can be done cheaper than the existing way of creating energy.
So a mechanism there is a just hard mandate about a target and a certain amount of the power that has to come from renewables, or a hard mandate about EV targets, yes. and then they figure out the way to get there.
Yes. And I think we've seen this work over and over. My point is, we set the rules. The point I've been saying in my campaign, I'm not opposed to private industry. I'm very opposed. I'm unalterably opposed to private industry writing the rules under which they operate. We need to make sure that the government is responding to the needs of the American people, not to the people who run the biggest American corporations and their profits.
Given that you have been working on this for a while, why do you think the sort of center of policy focus has shifted from carbon fee, which it really was, I think, 10 or 12 years ago, either through cap and trade or a fee and dividend or a carbon tax, or whatever you want to call it, to a more approach like you're describing? What was the thinking that moved it from one place to another?
I think there's a couple things going on, Chris. One is in California, we can actually study, we've had the most progressive energy laws in the world,
right.
And we've been growing very fast. But we can go back and look and see what caused the changes, what caused people to actually change their behavior. And we can see that rules really work. And that's for government to set rules is the job of government, for people to do what's in the interest of the American people and to set rules for industry to abide by. That's the essence of government. And it's worked. Whereas I think before people were very interested in making sure that we didn't disrupt anything. What we can see is if you set rules and give people runway to live up to it, doesn't disrupt anything, and in fact, it works very well.
Of course, there are some disruptions, right? So things like fossil fuel extraction, the fossil fuel industry is going to, in its current form, go out of business almost by definition, right? You talk about in the plan a fund, and other people have called for similar things for those workers. How do you assure people that that is going to be a real thing? We've seen programs like, say, Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA, which was a promise by the federal government to folks that were going to be harmed by trade agreements, that they would get training, et cetera, and the program has essentially been a complete failure. What do you say to people that's credible about making sure they do not fall through the cracks?
First of all, I agree with the criticism of what's happened in the past, and that's why people are so skeptical, workers are so skeptical. They have an existing job. It pays a living wage. They're very scared of the promises of politicians to take care of them in some ephemeral way at some time in the future. That's why we set $50 billion aside to make sure that we're not solving this problem on the backs of working people. Second of all, we have a commitment to going to those communities to ask them how they want that money to be spent. I think the third thing is to make sure that we're talking to representatives of those working people as we develop the plan, to make sure that the interest of those people are included, because my plan creates 4.6 million jobs that I would push really hard to be well-paid, organized jobs throughout the United States every year for 10 years. So my goal would be to make sure.
That's a lot. I mean, how much? What is the price tag per year on this?
My plan is to have it's $2 trillion over 10 years. But Chris, I think we all know that nothing lasts forever. I want to rebuild America in a sustainable way. But let's be clear, we need to rebuild America. We know that we have not kept up with our spending in terms of infrastructure. I want to make sure that that spending is done in a smart way, that is done in a way that protects our health and safety and looks to the future. But we need to do this spending anyway. So in fact, what I'm talking about is doing it on an accelerated basis with a specific eye to sustainability and to good paying jobs and clean air and clean water. But we're going to have to spend this money anyway. My interest in this is to make sure that we have at the table the representatives of those working people. So as we design this plan, we make sure that as much as possible, not only are we protecting them with money, but with the design of the plan to make sure that as we create jobs, we're taking care of them in every way we possibly can. And that means having their representatives help to design the plan.
So you have, your organizations that you've either funded or worked with have done a number, as you said, a number of ballot initiatives, a number of big political fights. I'm curious if you can talk about what the contours of the arguments in those fights were and what you learned from them about what arguments work and what arguments don't work.
So the first political fight I had was in 2010 when I co-chaired a proposition to protect California's progressive energy laws. I was opposed by 2 oil companies, and no one thought we had a chance in the world. My co-chair was George Shultz, and we said, we're not only going to beat these people, and people around the state thought they were unbeatable because they thought that oil companies had, bottomless pockets.
And this is a ballot initiative.
Ballot initiative. We said, we're not only going to beat them, we're going to smash them. And we're going to do it with a different coalition and a different message. So one thing people need to understand in this country is who cares about pollution, sustainability, environment, clean energy, climate. Number 1, Latinos. Number 2, African Americans. Number 3, Asian Americans. We started at the community level, making sure we had support of the environmental justice community and broadly across the state. We got all the unions on our side. We got half the chambers of commerce. We talked about how the clean energy would create hundreds of thousands or millions of jobs in California, which has in fact happened. We said we would fight for them to be well-paid union jobs, which has in fact happened. We also said we will clean up the air and water in California as a result of this and make people healthier. So we talked about the impacts on human beings now. I think over the last 10 years, and this is 10 years ago, the immediate impacts of climate change through fires and floods and hurricanes and the natural disasters that have hit virtually every state in the United States have brought home to people that not only can we do good by cleaning up America, we can avoid the worst ravages of climate change. So I think people are becoming more aware of what we're trying to prevent, but we were really going on, this is going to be a huge positive thing for California. We're going to clean up the air, we're going to make your kids healthy, and we're going to create millions of jobs.
Do you think the arguments used by either fossil fuel companies or their representatives in Vanguard are they changing in any way? Do you see them changing, and what does that mean?
I have no idea what arguments they're making. I hear occasional things from the president, which look, the basic lie that fossil fuel companies give you is you can either have a healthy economy or a healthy environment. That's a straight up lie. I spent a year examining it. The truth is a healthy environment produces a healthy economy. They are not one or the other, it's both and. In fact, having a devastated environment will kill our economy. So that's what and as far as I can tell, the only argument that I've ever heard that they've made is that one. I occasionally hear Mr. Trump start talking about socialism, but I don't think
or windmills cause cancer.
There is no coherent argument on the other side. We've won the argument.
Yeah.
We've won
That's
the
a fair
argument.
point.
It's now just a straight up fight. They like the money. Can they control our government to prevent us from doing what's necessary to protect the health and safety of every American and actually make us richer and healthier? That's the fight.
There was a line in your climate plan that caught my eye that was about requiring, I think, banks or investors, and particularly fossil fuel companies, to account for what are called stranded assets, right? Which is stranded assets are the carbon and fossil fuels that they have on their books as things they might put into market that they won't be able to because of the climate. How do you think finance and financing works, as someone who worked in that yourself, as a lever in getting towards the goals?
So when you think about banks, insurance companies, and investors, they're always projecting the future. So this can actually be a really powerful lever to make sure that we start doing the right thing right now. And I'll give you an example. If you're going to build a house and get a 30-year mortgage in a place that is going to be increasingly threatened by hurricanes, in order to build that house, most people need a 30-year mortgage, which means that someone's going to lend you money for 30 years, which means if your house gets washed away, they're not going to get their money back.
Right.
Now, normally a bank will only do that in one of those places if they get flood insurance. So an insurance company is going to get paid money every year to take the risk that the house gets washed away. If insurance companies decide that it's too risky, they won't provide the flood insurance, then the bank won't make the loan, then you can't buy the house. So it can be an incredibly powerful lever to stop things happening so that people start to realize, oh my goodness gracious, this is real. It sort of brings the future into the present. So I think it's really important as we look at finance that it can be a lever to push people to realize the future is now. We have to act, and that, Chris, that's my biggest point. Delay on this is not something we can delay on. I'm calling a state of emergency for the United States because it is an emergency, and we need to recognize that. It doesn't mean we can't solve it. We can solve it, and we can do it in a way that makes us better in every way. But you can't say, you can't miss a challenge that's only going to get bigger and think you're doing your job.
You are someone who has not, as far as I know, run for office before, or not held office before.
Right.
Obviously, that is by no means disqualifying the current president of the United States. That is true of. What do you say to people, who say, look, what you're talking about is incredibly ambitious. It's an incredibly crucial moment to get this right. And the current president who ran with no experience has not worked out very well. Why should we elect someone that has never had a job like this?
Look, for the last 10 years, as an outsider in the political system, I have been organizing coalitions of ordinary American citizens to fight unchecked corporate power. And we've been winning. Starting with that fight in California when we took on the oil companies, but I've taken on monopoly utilities, taken on the tobacco companies, taken on the drug companies, and won. So if you believe, which is what I believe, that this government has failed because there's a hostile corporate takeover that's gone on, then job one is to get back our government of, by, and for the people. And you have to ask, who's going to do that? Someone from outside the system who's been doing it successfully for a decade, or someone from inside the system who's part of the system? And my argument is, I've been doing this for 10 years successfully. That's what I perceive the issue to be in terms of American government. I think 80% of Americans agree that in fact our government has been bought by corporations. And the question is, who is actually going to step up and get that done? I've been doing it for 10 years successfully.
But also running the government's hard.
Let me, okay, so
I mean this seriously. Like, when you're talking about a whole government approach or a climate emergency, when you're talking about convening the cabinet to make sure all the, this is an administrative challenge, and I've said this to the multiple candidates I've talked to. It's an administrative challenge, on the order of World War II mobilization, on the order of coordinating the New Deal, which were, extremely difficult things to pull off administratively.
Yes, and you're talking to someone who's built a multi-billion-dollar international business from scratch, one room, no windows, no employees. You're talking to somebody who started one of the biggest grassroots organizations in the United States. I am the person who said 2 years ago, we need to impeach this president and we need the American people's voice to be heard, and we have over 8 million signatures. When you're talking about running organizations, when you're talking about putting together teams to work on things, why don't you take a look and see which of these people has really done that? I have done that for my entire career, is in fact putting together organizations to take on huge challenges that other people don't want to do. That's exactly my history. Look, this is a very complicated government. Putting together teams of 5,000 people is not the first time I'll do that.
You just mentioned something I want to just circle back to when you talk about the utilities, because I think they're a part of this, and because you have experience going toe-to-toe with them, they're a part of the landscape here that I think gets overlooked a lot. People talk about the fossil fuel companies a lot, obviously, but they don't talk about the utilities much. But the utilities can be, as interest groups and as power centers, as much of an obstacle as resistant to change as anyone in the landscape.
Or partners in change.
Right. So explain to me, what role do utilities play both in the technical sense and in the political economy sense? Because they are an enormous part of the landscape here.
They certainly are. And I think when you look at how energy is generated, electricity is generated around the United States, it's done on a local or state basis. So there will be a local monopoly utility, which is granted the utility by the locality to generate energy. And often they're the most important political player in that area. So they decide what plants to build, they run the distribution lines, and they're the people who deliver electricity to every business and every home. And what we've found is they can be a great supporter, or they can push and be incredibly resistant to change. But what's true now, and the reason that I believe we can win in terms of electricity generation, is it's cheaper to do it with renewables than with fossil fuels. For a long time, they would make the argument, we just can't afford it. They're very resistant to change, partially because they have a mandate to make sure they always deliver electricity, that it never goes down, that a hospital never shuts down in the middle of an operation because there's an outage. So they're very conservative about how they do it. But the truth is, the technology has moved. What people were promising about renewables is true. That's the lowest cost energy in the United States. So you see utilities, for instance, Iowa does 42% of its energy from wind. Iowa. Why is that true? Because they have a very progressive utility, and they've pushed really hard, and they pay farmers a bunch of money to set up the windmills in their fields, and it's profitable for everybody, and it's cheap energy. So what we can see is the technology has moved, which has always been my point. American ingenuity, American know-how, American work. That's what's going to get us out of this. Right. And we're there. That's what I was saying. Would I invest in R&D? Absolutely. I totally believe in it. Do we have the technology, and are we on the curve to where we can do this? Right now, yes, we can do this. There's no point for despair. The only thing we need to do is make it priority one and do it.
All right, I think we'll take some questions here from students. We'll start down here at the microphone.
Hello, Mr. Steyer. Thank you so much for coming today. So Marianne Williamson has said that many Americans won't be swayed by facts, as political loyalties and affiliations of recent years have largely been driven by emotion and gut. Particularly with regard to the issue of climate change, how do you plan to get through to voters who are reluctant and in many cases unwilling to take facts and data into account when making their 2020 vote?
So let me say that I agree with Marianne Williamson that people make their decisions from the neck down. They make them with their heart, they make them with their guts, and I think that's an appropriate way to make decisions, actually. And so I think this isn't this is not a scientific question. Science guides the way we feel about this question, but what I say to Americans is this is not a cause for despair. This is a cause for us to come together and do something incredibly important that we can do that will be the crowning achievement of many of our lives. So when I think about this, I really do see this as an opportunity for American achievement, American moral leadership, and a responsibility to do the right thing. And so, for instance, if you think about preserving God's earth, boom, here we go. If you think about really coming together as a people, in particular, I said environmental justice is at the core of what we're doing, making sure that we're taking care of the most vulnerable communities and people amongst us. Boom, that's what we're doing. Making sure that working people are better paid. Yeah. So I agree with Marianne Williamson completely. And my point about this is, this can be a great achievement and a joyous time for Americans to do the right thing and to succeed in doing the right thing.
Right. We're going to go to a questioner in University of Southern California, where we've got some folks who are watching along with us out there.
Hi, Mr. Steyer. My name is Alexis Arrayas. I am studying political science here at the University of Southern California. On Wednesday evening, President Trump announced that he would be revoking California's authority to set limits on pollution regulations that exceed that of the federal government. Recognizing that this regulatory approach is likely the most powerful plan ever implemented to reduce greenhouse gases, how would you propose we overcome the damage that would be done to California's ambitious efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and combat climate change?
So Alexis, thank you for that question. As a Californian, let me say this. I think what the president is doing is illegal, that in fact, California has a right to put in basically clean air rules for the state, and there are a bunch of other states that follow us. If you look at where the carbon pollution is coming from in California, the biggest source is transportation. So in fact, putting in rules which the car companies know they can meet and which they have supported is not something that is going to hurt us economically. It's in fact something necessary to get on top of carbon emissions in their most important source in our state. So in fact, we are going to have to overcome Mr. Trump on this, because in this, he is actually abdicating his basic responsibility to the American people as commander-in-chief. His job number one, is to protect the safety and the health of Americans as commander-in-chief. That's job one. He is actually doing everything he can to endanger the safety and health of every American citizen, in this case, including everybody in California. So what he is doing, I believe to be illegal. It is clearly immoral and is against his oath of office. And I believe that when you see someone doing something like that, you should fight him every single day. Maybe you should even start an impeachment petition.
All right. Thank you so much. We're going to go to this question down here at the microphone.
Hello, Mr. Steyer. My name is Steyer Lee. I'm from Georgetown University. Currently is a graduate student in Legislative Affairs program. You are talking about the better talks. So we know just the climate policy is not just for one country, it's just like connected all over the world. So if you were elected as the President of the United States, how can you engage, cooperate with other countries, help them, especially Asian countries like China, India, Korea, and Japan? So how can you just put yourself in a different position into the bilateral talks from the current administration? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important question. We don't have a simple relationship with any of those countries. We interact with them in so many different ways. We interact with them economically every single day in millions of ways. We have a trade relationship with those countries. We have a military relationship with those countries. We have a diplomatic relationship with those countries. Some of them are straight up allies. Some of them are what I call frenemies. People who we work together with, we cooperate with, we compete with, and sometimes they do things that we absolutely oppose. I think it's important in thinking about our relationships with those countries that we make sure they understand our values and our priorities. And I'm saying we now under my presidency, priority, we need together to solve the climate problem. And if you look at those countries, you can see they will be devastated by the worst impacts of climate change if in fact we don't do this. It is in their interest as well. But I will say one other thing is, we don't just have bilateral relationships in this world. This is a multilateral world where we have allies and we work together, not just with one country at a time, but across regions and across the whole world. So when I think about this, I think back to both what happened in Paris and how the Obama administration put together a worldwide treaty with 194 countries, starting with one, China. But I also look to the Obama administration's success in dealing with Iran, a country which we disagree with in many ways, whose regime has values that are antithetical to ours in many ways, but where in combination with several of our allies, we actually went to them and got them to do something that was in their interest and in our interest. So when I think about how we're going to work on climate change, look, every one of those countries is at risk, just as we are. Every one of those countries has economic interests. They would like to have cheaper energy and be able to grow just as we would and create good jobs. We need to make sure that our shared values are acknowledged, the differences are acknowledged, and we push forward together. This can't be done just by us.
We're going to take the next question. If you want to look over there from a student in Iowa State. We've got a bunch of students at Iowa State watching us. Welcome, Iowa State.
Hi, so my name is John Devalle. I'm a senior at Iowa State University, and I'm a public horticulture major. So my question is, often farmers and small town farmers especially are blamed for the effects of climate change. How do you suppose that if you become president, you would both ally and look to reconnect with those whom are in the small towns, who often feel very neglected and forgotten?
So that is a really important question. I think agriculture in general, in terms of climate, is really overlooked. And it's not only a source of about 18% of carbon emissions, it's also a source of substantial solutions to our problem. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about farmers and agriculture to make sure we're working with them to go out and get what we would think of as regenerative agriculture implemented to help them and to make them more profitable and also to help solve this problem. So when you think about what's going to happen there, what we're really going to need to do is make sure we're taking care of the topsoil itself and also sequestering carbon in the soil. And when you think about how we're going to do that, we're going to do that with some different agricultural techniques that we know right now. We're going to do it by having different root systems. I don't want to be too technical here, but we have the ability to do this in a way that will make the farmers more productive and more money. But they've got to be part of the solution here. They're a really important way that we're going to actually take carbon and sequester it back in the soil And I think that this is something that's overlooked, and I think it's going to make them richer, and it's going to be really important in the state of Iowa that this happen, and that farmers not be forgotten, but be right at the forefront of what we're doing.
I'll follow up on that. Do you support dollars for research in carbon sequestration or technologies to take carbon out of the air?
Yes. Look, we know that we're going to have to do things to sequester carbon, and in fact, our family has been running a ranch for 10 or 15 years to try and to show how we can do that, different agricultural techniques of raising animals in a way that actually will help us on a climate basis and a carbon basis.
But I mean, other than agricultural, like mechanical technologies.
Look, I know that. There is a lot of talk about carbon capture and sequestration, basically taking carbon at the source, capturing it, and then putting it somewhere or using it somewhere. If we can show that works on a cost-effective basis, it will be absolutely critical. Right now, it's not close, Chris.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really important as we implement our program to be data-driven and to be honest about what's going on. I look to see what the cost of solar is and what the cost of wind is and compare everything to what we can do to make sure we're creating jobs, to make sure that our economy is healthy. And anything that we can do that's a realistic thing, we should put a lot of time and energy and money into. But I think we've got to be realistic too about the things that we know work, the things that we can see will work, and the things that might work. And I put that in the category of it might work, I'm willing to pursue it hard, but I don't want to depend on it. Because there's nothing that, it's not in the it does work or I know it will work category at this point. I'm not sure it can be cost effective.
Let's go down here to you.
Welcome to Georgetown, Mr. Steyer. I'm Anvita. I'm a PhD student here in economics, and I'm from India. You spoke earlier about the US taking a moral and technological leadership on the world stage when it comes to combating climate change. The US and other developed countries have benefited from the use of fossil fuels to industrialize themselves in the past and have frankly been the biggest contributors to climate change so far, while countries like mine are just about now getting on the industrialization bandwagon. Do you think the US should also take more of the load of curbing fossil fuel use? And under your leadership, will the US relax patents on renewable energy infrastructure so that renewable energy is more financially viable to developing countries?
So first of all, let me agree with you. And that argument is one that absolutely motivates my climate plan. When I said I would make it my first priority, that I would declare a state of emergency, I don't understand how we can go to India and say we have this huge joint problem, which we do, and we're looking for you to solve it. I agree with you. For us to take leadership on this, we have to get our own house in order first. And that's why it's absolutely essential, given that it's an international problem, that we act for ourselves first, so that when we go to India, which is an absolutely critical country in terms of this global alliance, that we can say, we've made this priority one, we're going to make this work for you. And to be fair, I've looked at the impacts of India on climate change, and I'm sure you have too. They can be completely devastating. So it is absolutely in India's interest to make sure that together we solve this problem on behalf of the over 1 billion people who live in India, just as it is for us in the United States. So I agree with you. It is absolutely essential that we go to India as a moral leader, but with technology in hand to make sure that it works economically for them too, and that we do what we can, that we go out of our way to make sure that this is not a, you need to solve our problem, you're going to undergo a lot of pain or not develop the way you want. In fact, that we can do this in a win-win way. Absolutely critical, completely agree.
We're going to go next to a student at the University of Southern California, USC.
Hi there. My name is Thomas Martin. I am a junior here at USC studying political science and legal studies. A report from Brown University released in June revealed that the U.S. Department of Defense is the world's single largest consumer of petroleum and also the single largest producer of greenhouse gases. Our military endeavors also leave pockmarks of ecological damage wherever they take place. There's no question that our war efforts, which take place across the globe, are a major part of the climate crisis. How would you, as president, tackle this issue of decarbonizing and scaling back our military efforts without sacrificing national security?
So that is a concern that has existed for a long time. And actually, if you talk to the leaders of the services, which I've done, they've been very aware of this, both from the standpoint of their energy use and also to the threat multiplier that climate change is for the globe and therefore for their job. So in fact, I think it's absolutely critical that we green our armed services, and they agree. Literally every service is aware of their carbon footprint. They're aware of the impact on their bases in the United States, some of which are are on the coast and therefore extremely threatened. But in addition, they're aware that their job is made infinitely more difficult and can be, multiply how hard it is as a result of climate change. So the services actually have been on top of this for a long time. Congress has prevented them in many ways from greening their behavior.
I mean, but they are enormous fossil fuel consumers, enormous, and
the biggest,
literally the biggest, and that alone, just put everything aside, forget the utilities and cars, just decarbonizing the United States military is an enormous undertaking.
And we'll do it. Look, and I'll make another point. I'll tell you guys, I don't know if you're aware, but in Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the most dangerous things that happened was transporting fuel across the country, because you have huge tankers that are essentially bombs bringing fuel to the front. And the services were extremely intent on creating solar panels wherever troops were as a way of avoiding having to basically give those gigantic targets going on roads that everybody could see and shoot at and kill people, kill Americans. So look, we are going to have to change. The armed services are a perfect example of a place where the leaders want to change, where we have the technology to change. It should not hurt our capabilities, but where we have to push hard, and in the places where there are issues that we have to do the research to make sure we overcome them, but there aren't that many.
Let's go to the question right here.
Hello, Mr. Steyer. My name is Ben Tulerski. I'm a freshman here at Georgetown studying government in the college, and I'm originally from Nashua, New Hampshire. You have no formal political experience, but as president, how would you use that to your advantage to be able to work with politicians on both sides of the aisle to change the way climate issues are addressed by our government?
Well, to me, the biggest question here is a retelling of what this means. I think that the president's job, it has all these executive things that are written in the Constitution and all that, but really the president gets to focus the nation on what counts and explain to the world what we're about, what we stand for, and what we need to do. And this is a perfect example of how that stands, is to explain to the American people directly of both parties what's at stake here, what our capabilities are, what we're going to do, and why it's going to be great for them. Look, I look at this, and people have cast climate change as this terrifying truth. If we don't deal with it, that can be true. But we have solutions. We need to implement them, and it actually can be, this challenge can be our greatest opportunity too. And I think it's the president's job to make it clear that this challenge is a great opportunity, that it's a chance for us to pull together and do something amazing together. Republicans are threatened by this as well. Republicans will be employed by this as well. This is actually a chance for us to come together and to move past the very divisive rhetoric that is really coming out of a small number of companies that have basically purchased our government.
But do you think there are any Republican votes for a Green New Deal or any of the climate agenda you have?
I think that if the American people decide that this is job one and that they're going to insist on it, the answer will be yes, Chris. I think if you went to the Congress today, the answer would be no, and I acknowledge that. That's why I've said I would declare a climate emergency on day one and use the emergency powers of the presidency on day one while calling on Congress to pass a Green New Deal in 100 days. The issue here is if you follow the science, we can't wait. It is an emergency. We can't wait for them to hear from their constituents. If they're not listening now, we need to make sure that we're acting now and going out to the country to say, this is job one, this is the priority, we need to meet this challenge, we can meet this challenge, and if people get in the way, they're wrong.
Just so I'm clear, you would move climate legislation would be the first piece of domestic legislation you would push for?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Layla Ogavian. Hello, Mr. Steyer.
Good morning.
Good morning. I am from California, Sacramento, California, and I am a master's student at the McCourt School of Public Policy. And my question is, first, I am a firm believer that government cannot solve this crisis alone. And so I would like to hear from you, as an individual that comes from big business and big money, how would you get big corporations to be a leader in solving the climate crisis?
So that really that's a great question in terms of framing how the whole country works. So let me say this. I did come from the private sector. I worked in the private sector for 30 years. I know that innovation and creativity and entrepreneurship resides in the private sector. I also know that the rules and laws of society are supposed to be set by elected officials who are thinking only about the welfare of the American people. So in fact, I expect the elected officials to set the rules and to do it on behalf of the American people for their benefit alone. And then companies work within those rules in order to innovate, to understand, okay, if that's the rule, here's what we can do in the fastest, smartest, newest way. Great. The problem has arisen because these companies have decided they want to set the rules for how they're going to work. And that has led us to a place where they're not acting in the interest of the American people and where the government isn't really representing us. So in fact, I see this as they're two separate parts of American society with different responsibilities and strengths. And as long as they keep to their separate spheres, then we do really well and we get justice. The problem is if one starts to bleed over into the other, it doesn't work, and it's happened for 40 years that corporations have been buying our government. We need to take it back. But that doesn't mean we don't need corporations to do their job. We're counting on them, in fact, to do the work, to be smart, to be creative, to work hard. We just want to do it in the rules that we set up for them.
Let me ask about the private sector, because most of your life has been spent in the private sector. You were an investor. There's some who've criticized you for having invested in fossil fuel companies in the past, for holding those in your portfolio, and who say that that's hypocritical, that what you're doing now. What do you say to them?
Look, when I was running an investment firm, we invested in every part of the economy, including fossil fuels. When I realized that actually there was an unintended consequence of fossil fuels. Look, we come from a fossil fuel-based economy. Everybody in the United States of America. Then I divested, took the giving pledge, and started to work as hard as possible to make sure that that unintended consequence of climate change didn't ruin our society. So I am asking Americans to do exactly what I did, which is to say, look, we've all come from this fossil fuel economy. We need to make a change. We can make that change, and we should do it as expeditiously as possible, given that we want to make sure that we keep the economy going. Do we want to make sure that it does it in a way that employs people better, higher wages, more jobs, and makes us healthier? But we all need to make this change. I made this change,
So you have no investments, even passive index, things like that, in fossil fuels?
Look, I set up divestment rules years ago, and there's a process to get out of it, and I think there's probably some dregs left, but I've also said if they missed some of it, if the process, the red tape of getting out of all that isn't done but when we set it up, then any profits I'd get from that, I'll give away to charity. I've also taken the giving pledge to give away my money while I'm living to good causes. So I wanted to make sure, yes, I set up divestment rules. The process takes longer than I would like, but if there's anything left, I want to make sure people understand that money would only go to charity. There's no way I could possibly profit.
Hi, Mr. Steyer. Thank you for being here today. My name is Nate Bergen, and I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service studying science, technology, and international affairs.
Perfect.
And my question is, yes, applicable. In terms of the innovation necessary to combat climate change, how would a Steyer administration budget the resources, the time, and the money between basic research, which is led by academia and government and often has a longer time horizon, and applied research that private industry could implement right away?
So the tradition of government is to support basic research. And I'm a huge believer in that in fact so much of American innovation and corporate success has come out of the basic research done through the American government, including, as most famously, the internet, but lots of other stuff too, and a lot of it out of the Defense Department. So I think that's actually the government's job. I think there's a different job when it comes to applied research. I think traditionally the only thing the government has done in applied research is to try and provide financing sometimes to make it more possible when they feel that financing wouldn't be available in the private sector. But the government job really is that, basic research. I think that that's an incredibly important part of America's edge. This administration has tried to cut it every single year. In my mind, that's entirely wrong-headed. That's the kind of intellectual and technological edge that has made America grow faster than other countries, that I think we should continue to do, and which I completely believe in terms of climate, energy, agriculture, all the things we've been talking about. We need to make sure that we are on the cutting edge of learning the new technologies and leading the world. Thank you.
It seems to me like there's a huge, when you look at the need and when you look at the data on new firm formation and also where venture capital money is going, there's just a huge mismatch and misallocation of capital right now through financial markets into someone that's going to send you, like some startup that's going to send you a kit of laundry detergent for your pet every week, or whatever new thing there is, or the 9th scooter business. And when it's just incredible need for a million different engineering solutions that are much more difficult, take much longer, are much higher capital and capital intensive, and yet the way that the market signals are working and the way that investment markets are working is that is not getting the capital it needs, and a lot of other pretty trivial stuff is.
Look, investors are investing for money. The government is supposed to represent the needs and interests of the American people. They're completely different functions, and you can't count on investors to do the latter. That's why the government is so important. That's why government research is so important, and the support of research around the United States of America. And that's just the structure of the way we allocate money in this country, and we need to make sure that the government does its part to make sure that we answer the deep questions in front of us in a way that's successful.
All right, question right here.
Hi, my name is Ruth. Thank you for being here. My question is also about California, but from a slightly different angle.
Are you from California?
I'm not, but as you know, California and 23 other states have sued the current administration over an escalating state-federal tug-of-war when it comes to regulating carbon emissions. So how would your administration work with states to change the current dynamic, and how would you garner support from states and people who are not on board yet and may even try to undermine federal regulations?
So under my administration, there would be an entirely different fight, because I agree with California. And so I would be pushing as hard as possible, as fast as possible, to get carbon emissions under control. And that would be job one. And I would expect, looking at what happened under the Obama administrations, that there might be states that would be resisting that. But what we can see is that actually from a cost of energy standpoint, from a job creation standpoint, and from a health standpoint, this is better for the American people. So in fact, I would push extremely hard to make sure that every state was moving on this as fast as possible while safeguarding jobs and health.
Last question, I think, here.
Hello, Mr. Steyer and Mr. Hayes. My name is Rahul Parikh, and I'm a sophomore in the McDonough School of Business. And my question for you today is, how do you see 5G technology and innovations like smart grids and autonomous vehicles impacting the climate debate as we go into the future?
So those are three very different technologies. But what they all point out is that there are going to be innovations in the world that are going to make things possible for us that aren't possible today. And we're going to need to make sure, as we see these innovations happen, that they are in fact going to help us in terms of solving the climate crisis, not hurt us, and that we use the innovations, lots of those things, you're talking about the smart grid. That enables so many different things in terms of the way that we generate electricity and move it around. You're talking about autonomous vehicles. That's something which people believe can be actually a huge reducer of emissions from transportation. So really what we're saying is, on a generalized basis, that innovation is something that can move us forward in a way that is positive. We also need to be clear on some of these innovations that there aren't unintended consequences. So when we think about them, we're going to have to be smart and honest with ourselves about what they're causing and making sure that they don't harm Americans unintentionally. But in general, innovation, entrepreneurship, technology, that's been driving this country for hundreds of years. It's going to continue to. We just need to make sure that we take care of Americans as it happens, because there can be unintended consequences that really hurt people in the real world, and those are American citizens, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we take care of them too.
All right. Great questions, everyone. Tom Steyer, thank you very much. That was great. Appreciate it.